Rommel at Gazala, a game that came out a couple of years ago. It was published by the designer as a DTP game, now has been picked up and reprinted by LnL Games in a deluxe edition. It is something that they have been doing quite a bit, that the LnL folks lately, to remake games, to make them look better, to give them a facelift. And, well, the games look better after the LnL treatment. The original game that I have somewhere here in my gamer cave came in a Ziploc bag. This one comes in a nice box. It has attractive components, a nice colorful manual, nice map, nice counters. Everything looks pretty good. But how about the game itself? The game, quite clearly set in World War II. It is a war game that depicts Rommel's struggle against the Allied fortified lines outside of Tobruk in 1941. So the attempt by Rommel to go past the fortified line to reach Tobruk. So here we have a two-player game, which is also played as a solitaire game. It's absolutely playable that way, in which a player will represent the Axis with German and Italian forces, and the other player will represent the Commonwealth with a group of allied units, including a lonely French unit that defends here. Well, that's not the only unit that the Allies have. They have many more. Units are represented on the map by these counters here. Everything is pretty traditional, simple and basic. This game was always meant to be an introduction to wargaming. So you have things that you expect in the most traditional war games, which is not a bad thing at all. We have units rated for two factors, the first one being a combat factor, the second one movement factor, a movement allowance, and then you have a symbol indicating the type of military unit represented by the counters. So we have tank, we have infantry, motorized infantry, the usual suspects. And most units are double-sided, so they have a side that represents the full fresh side and a side that represents the reduced side that the unit is flipped to when the unit takes losses. We also have air points, or better, an air marker that is placed on the air points table, and players can spend points during their turn to land air support to attacks or defenses, that is, to combats in which they are attackers or defenders. The counters are pretty high quality. They do look good. Since we're talking about the deluxe edition, we may as well talk about the components too. The graphics, the colors, everything is nice. They're slightly on the thin side, but imperceptibly so. In general, they look pretty good. They look like they're coated. They're definitely sturdy and durable. Large size, larger than most counters these days. So, good stuff. The map is printed on cardboard. It is two separate pieces of cardboard. Again, it is slightly coated so that it looks resistant against light, not heavy, but light possible water spills. At the same time, it doesn't feel too slippery, or it doesn't have too much of a glare when there is light shining on it. Now, in this game, the allied player will set up more or less in this area. Some units will be inside the Tobruk fortification. Most units will be around here, defending the main fortified line, and some units here in reserve that will probably try to fill the gaps as the Axis advance. Let's take a closer look, because one of the most important landscape features here is not visible at a distance, and this is the landscape feature that really dominates the game, which is Landmine Hex Sites. They are there, of course, to defend the ally position, so the ally player doesn't need to worry about them, but for the Axis player, they present all sorts of negative effects. An Axis unit spends half of its movement allowance to move across them. Also, there's a penalty to attack across a Landmine Hex Site, and lines of supply cannot be traced across Landmine Hex Sites unless the Axis player has found a gap. An Axis unit can choose to try to probe a Landmine Hex Site, looking for a gap. You roll a die, and if you're lucky, you do find a gap. So you place a marker there to indicate that, for all intents and purposes, that hex site there is now a normal hex site. It doesn't have a landmine in it, or not, doesn't have a landmine that really affects things anymore. At least when it comes to supplies and movement, it still affects things when it comes to combat. So we have the ally player defending in this area and all the way down here. So most of the defenders are in the central area, in the northern area of the fortified line, but you have this lonely defender here. This is very important because the Axis units will set up more or less in this area, and there's a lot of freedom for the Axis player about initial setup. The Axis player can experiment with a lot of different ways of setting up his units. There's quite a bit of them, of Italian and German units, and they may go in different configurations. That means that in one game the Axis player may try to push towards the top here and just try to go head-on against the fortifications and the tough line of defenders around here. Or the Axis player may try more of an outmaneuvering, over an outflanking maneuver, trying to move towards this area where the defenses are weaker, there are less defenders, but on the other hand, that means that now the Axis player is leaving lines of supply a little bit unprotected. So this is the big trade-off here. You move straight on, straight ahead, and you protect your defense, your supply lines, but you're hitting your head against the hard wall of defenses, or you try outflanking, but then you had to worry about having your supply lines cut by allied units that may move past the fortified line precisely to cut your supply lines. Supply lines are checked at the beginning of a turn, and units that are not able to trace a line of supply free of enemy units, enemies also control, and not going through landmines, and they're not able to trace such a line of supply to a supply source on their edge of the map, or a limited supply source for allied units, well, those units have their values halved, movement and combat, which can be pretty punitive. So the Axis player sets up here, the allied player there, and then it's time to fight. But definitely the momentum, the pace of the action will be determined by the Axis early decisions, as the allied player here is the defender and also is in the role of the reactive player. Can be a creative reaction, doesn't have to be a dull reaction, but you really have to see what the heck the Axis player is going to attempt before, as the allied player, you decide to attempt a certain course of action. Gameplay is pretty basic, pretty straightforward, and again, very classic. It is stripped down to the basics of wargaming. You start a turn by checking supplies, so you determine if that turn there will be units that will perform not at their full capacity. Then you may have the replacement phase. You don't have that in the early turns of the game. Later on, you do, and that is when you will be able to replenish weakened units, flipping them to their main site, or to bring back to the board the units that have been removed from the board from previous combats. Also, there is a concept here that is armor recovery, which means for each hit that your armor units take, you record that hits on the recovery chart here on display array, and for each 3 losses that the LA player experiences, or 4 that the Axis player experiences, the corresponding player gains a point of armor recovery. I guess you're putting together parts that have survived, the units that have survived from previous attacks, and you form larger units. You use those to repair units that are on the board. This is what I think the rationale is here. So starting from turn 4, this is only when you have the replacement phase. Units may be brought back, may be strengthened, but early on it is just a slaughter that is just frontal, and it's just attrition without any form of recovery. In any case, after supply and possible replacement, you have the heart of the turn, which is again as classic as you can have it. Units on the board first move, and they move up to their full movement allowance. Roads will simplify movements. Terrain affects movements. Again, movement allowance is the one here on the right of the counter. You move, and when you encounter an enemy unit, you have to stop because units project an enemy zone of control in the 6 hexes surrounding them. So you move all of your units, and then after you and in all of your units you don't have to move, and after you completed movement you have to resolve combat between units that are in an enemy zone of control. So you have to attack, and combat is as simple as it gets. Again, very classic, like we used to do it in the old days, which is you calculate a ratio between the total strength of the attacker and the total strength of the defender. You turn that into a ratio that will correspond to one of the columns here on the combat table, anything between 1 to 3 to 6 to 1. That would be the attacker being 6 times stronger than the defender being 3 times stronger than the attacker. Modifiers may apply based on the composition of the units, and this is the only aspect of the game where there's a bit of complexity, not for the experienced wargamer whatsoever, but for new wargamers. I mean, this is clearly an introductory wargame that the new wargamers can enjoy and play without much trouble, but this will be the part where the new wargamers want to pay attention, which is when it comes to modifiers, because the presence of certain units in certain groups will give you positive modifiers if the opponent doesn't have a unit that is adequate to defend. For example, having an armor unit in combat when the opponent doesn't gives you a bonus. But there are units that may not give you the bonus if you have them in attack, but they may deny the bonus if the opponent has the corresponding unit. You have Rommel Red Quarter. This is a special unit that the Axis player can move quite freely around the board, and that also gives bonuses to the units that are being directly led by Rommel into attack. So various things of this type that will determine the bonuses, but at the end of the day, when the bonuses have been calculated, you have the final column, you roll the die, you cross-reference the column that you're using with the die roll, and you will have the result, which will be 2 numbers. The first one applying to the attacker, the second one to the defender, and the number indicates the number of losses that a side must take. For example, here 2 for the attacker, 1 for the defender. E means that side is completely eliminated. And losses can be taken in the form of retreats or hits. Hits, that is, simply step reductions from the strength of the units. So this is really the basic procedure. The Axis player takes a turn going through supply phase, replacement, movement, and combat. The ally player does the same, and the procedure is repeated until the end of the game. Victory at that point is determined based on victory points that players collect by eliminating enemy units and by taking control of key objectives on the board. Tobruk, for example, is obviously worth a lot of victory points to the Axis player, whereas speaking of unique ways of collecting points, the ally player gains victory points for, among other things, eliminating the Rommel headquarters. So Rommel at Gazala definitely is a simple introductory level war game, but it doesn't mean that it is a game that only works as an introduction. It doesn't have anything to offer to the seasoned war gamer. Actually, I think that this is quite a flexible game in that it has something to offer to many different types of players. For new gamers, well, for new war gamers, they will find a game that has lower density of counters, so the logistics of the game are not too complicated. It doesn't take too long to set it up, doesn't take too long to learn it or to play it. It is playable in an evening. Actually, in an evening you may even be able to play more than one game. It is accessible for solitaire playing without any problem whatsoever. Allocating air points usually is more fun when you do it with 2 players instead of solitaire, playing both sides to the best of your possibilities. But other than that, there's no secret information, so there's really nothing that makes it a problem for solitaire play. All these things are good, especially for new wargamers. Maybe you have been wargaming curious and your friends are not wargamers, so you're wondering, will I be able to play a wargame all by myself? Try this one. This would be a good starting point, because I think the topic is interesting. World War II always attracts gamers. So the topic is interesting. The game is very playable. It's definitely playable. If anything, there is a little bit of freedom in the way you can set up units and you can try what-if scenarios, which means that you may diverge from historical lines considerably, but the game does remain very playable, fast-paced, it moves smoothly. You do not have to worry about a million procedures, and yet you have enough flavor there that you do get the sense that you are in fact playing a game about this specific campaign rather than just a version of chess on a colorful map that looks on the yellow side of things. So it's a good introductory word game for the experienced word gamer. It's definitely a word game on the lighter side, but a word game that is absolutely enjoyable. All the advantages that I mentioned for the beginner wargamer, of course, are there also for the seasoned wargamer that is introducing somebody to the hobby, or simply has an evening in which bigger, larger gamer wouldn't be played, or simply you're not always in the mood for the big monsters. Frankly, I definitely enjoy the simple, accessible, straightforward games that pack quite a punch when it comes to presenting me with challenges and with tough decisions. At the same time, I can experience that narrative. I can experience a full narrative in an evening without too much effort and without too much hassle. I like the fact that I can set up the game here in an evening, play it and test a strategy for the axis and then see whether that works or not, and then set it up again the same evening and try a different strategy and see how that pays off. Again, there are two main strategies really that rely on the, I would say, the angle of attack, the direction of the attack, or I should say the different concentration of forces along the front line from the Axis player. Those decisions, those different concentrations will trigger the chain of events that will follow. But definitely there is some experimentation that you can do there, which give also the game some welcome replay value, more than you would expect from a game that has overall a relatively small map, not many counters, not so much space for maneuver, but the fact that you can try with different setups and different chains of attack, I would say different directions of attack and concentration and different chains of reactions, that does give the game some welcome replay value. So Rommel at Gazala, not a monster game, not the blast of a war game like you may have with some big monsters, but definitely a game that is not very meaty, but while being lean and very digestible, it is still pretty tasty and flavorful. So Rommel at Gazala. Now we also have an edition that looks good, so all the better. Rommel at Gazala by LnL game. A war game that I would recommend to any beginner war gamers, and in any case to any war game that wants to have a quick, simple, accessible war game experience.